Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the session 35, I believe, the Evolving ISO. Thank you for coming today. I think this hopefully will be a very valuable panel discussion. We talk a lot about these days cybersecurity and the cyber threat and breaches. And I think a lot of people want to know if you're on point or responsible for security, cybersecurity for an organization. A lot of people want to know, how should I be evolving if I'm responsible for that? What does that look like? Executives want to know, the people serving that position want to know. So we thought we'd put a panel discussion together today, but we have an executive and we have someone responsible for security and privacy that can really share their experiences about what does this actual role look like? Where did it come from? What does it look like today? And where is it going? So I'd like to introduce Cathy Cleek, who is the CIO at the Franchise Tax Board, and then Jorge DeCesare, who is Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer at Dignity Health, formerly Catholic Healthcare West. And both of them are going to give a short opening statement, opening thoughts, and then we will dive into the panel discussion.
Great, I guess I'll start. I'll move over here. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate being invited to speak today and see all of you here. I'm going to start off with a quick, short word, and that word is trust. And how important is trust to us, to everyone? How many of us want to do business with a company or an organization that you don't trust? It's really, that's the part that we all struggle with, is we're given a lot of information and we're entrusted with that information. Whether it's a small mom and pop shop, where we go in and swipe our debit card, whether it's your banking institution that you entrust with all your financial information, or even for me, it's that patient that comes in and gives us all a lot of sensitive information that we're entrusted. Now, the role of the information security officer, that probably in the last 10 years has evolved significantly. I remember our security officer way back when was the guy that was an IT employee. He ran the mainframe and decided who had access to what information. Now it's that person who is at the executive level. It's that person who assesses risk, who defines policy, looks at the appropriate controls, writes the appropriate procedures, and makes certain that those folks that entrust us with information will continue to have that trust. Essentially, it's what's become to be known as a trust officer. Now, as organizations, we have in the last 10, 15 years invested heavily in moving from paper information to electronic information. And and of course, from the security perspective, we've moved away from having a lot of strong physical controls to now balancing physical controls with technical controls and administrative controls. We've also come to the realization that that information we have today is very valuable, not just because we're entrusted with it, but because we can now use it to make really good decisions and move forward our organizations in ways that we haven't been able to before, to look at how we can market services to appropriate demographics that need those specific services. Those are things that we didn't do 10, 15 years ago that we're doing now. How many have heard the term big data? That's the term for, we take all that information that we have and we apply analytics to it and we create value from that. And we as organizations have seen that value just rise in that data. However, so have the bad guys, and we've become targets of these bad guys who want to have that access to that information. Because of this dependency, at least in my organization and in a lot of large organizations, I've seen the information security officer role move from just that technical role to someone that now meets with the board of directors, that meets with the senior leadership and helps them make strategic decisions for safeguarding that information that we're entrusted with, so that it is secure and that it is available to make real-time decisions. In closing, I'm going to throw out a quick statistic and quick comment, and that is in the Federal Trade Commission every couple of years releases information about identity theft. For 2011, the FTC reported that victims of medical information identity theft suffered a loss on the average of $26,000 individually. That is a lot of money to somebody who, let's say, goes to a physician or to a hospital, has major surgery, is recovering at home, to now realize that somebody fraudulently used their information and are now have lost $26,000. Imagine if that was you and you were trying to recover from that and I had to clean that up. It's something that we deal with on a regular basis in healthcare, and it really impacts, not just in healthcare alone, but in other industries as well. Anyhow, thank you.
You started to trend, so I'll go up as well. I'm Cathy Cleek, and I'm the CIO at Franchise Tax Board. And for those of you who don't know me, I will never be the one who's going to put up a picture, a PowerPoint of a firewall, and let's talk about the network connectivity. My background, I started as an auditor and have a CPA license, and we had an executive officer who really wanted the business to be the driver, and he really worked hard at getting people who had strong business backgrounds into our IT organization, our ISO role, our privacy role, so that we knew how to run the business. He would always say, we can be secure, we can just turn off the outside world, but then we can't do the kind of work we need to do. So I think when I think about the ISO role, I really think about what a connected world we live in. And when you look forward, that connected world is only going to get more connected. I just was looking at a Cisco prediction, and they say 99% of the world, people and things, are yet to be connected. So if we only have 1% connected today and they're projecting 99%, the challenges we have ahead of us are great. As far as the role of a CIO, and when I think about this topic, I put this into two buckets, an internal bucket and an external bucket. And the first internal bucket, I really think about education, education, education. And people need to know what kind of risks are out there, how they need to behave. We cannot assume people know how to behave. We teach people how to behave in the workplace. We give them training all the time in whatever field you're working in. But security needs to be right there at the top of how you need to behave. The second thing I think in the internal piece is data. And the one piece of advice I would give to anyone if they asked me if I could only say one thing is know what people are using the data for, what they're doing with it, what's being sent out, where they're looking on the website. All of these things have a great chance, if people aren't using data well, to embarrass you. And no one wants to be embarrassed in this world, so anytime we get a new tool to look and see how people are using data, we always become a bit alarmed because we've done a lot of education and we think we've been very clear, but once you put in a tool, you will find people are using data in some very creative ways. And that's not good creative. And then third is to really look at the external point of view and what kind of technology can you bring into your organization to help you with education and data, but also to keep bad guys out. So in conclusion, the one thing I would say as far as the role of the ISO, if I had to say one skill set that I think is really important to you, is to be a good communicator. It's not know all the technology, but know how to communicate to people, because you're going to need money to do things, so you need to sell to an executive team. You need to be the key communicator as far as education, so you have to be able to get that message out. So being able to communicate in a way that whoever your audience is can really hear your message, I think is critical. So those are my opening thoughts, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. George, all right. So we'll have a few rounds of questions that I'm going to ask, and then we'll leave enough time to open it up to the audience to ask our panelists questions. So I think I'll start with you, George. What has been your experience over the last 2 to 3 years regarding cybersecurity and privacy in the healthcare world? What are the key trends from your perspective, and how are these trends shaping the role of ISO and senior management expectations about the ISO?
In the healthcare arena, we've had a lot of evolution, and a lot of it has to do with us moving from the old paper records to electronic health records. We've been pushed to move forward by either incentives initially or penalties at some point to get us to a point where we can now have electronic information which we can share. We're sort of being pulled in different directions with that, because we're being told, you know, you've got HIPAA. You know, we've all heard of HIPAA, and we've got to secure that information. We've got to keep the privacy of our patients at the top of our everything that we do, basically. But we're now being told, oh, by the way, if you want to have this information and you want to participate and get incentives, you have to share that information. And that's the challenges that we're facing today in healthcare, is that we're being pulled in different directions to saying you've got to secure it, but you also got to share it. You know, from the perspective of our senior leadership, the strategies have sort of varied depending on what we're trying to do, and some of it has to do with integrating our physicians to our hospitals. Some of it has to do with how we deliver information to our patients. And a lot of it has to do with how we improve our patient care and our patient experience. So what I've seen in my role is that I'm actually at the table having these discussions now, whereas before, 2-3 years ago, that wasn't the case. But now, because of the regulations and because of the items that we're being called upon to do, my role sits with the strategy groups to see how we're going to be able to accomplish these things, but in a manner that doesn't get us in trouble, keeps the trust of our patients, and we're able to continue to be effective.
So another question to kind of follow on off of that. In 2012, NASCIO and Deloitte conducted a cybersecurity study, and actually 48 of the 50 US states participated in the study. Very interesting observation is that and the study participants included ISOs and executives. Interesting finding in that study was that 74% of the ISOs said they had huge support from executives for the security program, but then 86% said they had a lack of sufficient funding to actually run the program. So there's a gap there. So maybe you could comment, Kathy and then George, on why do you think that gap exists? What should ISOs be doing differently to close that funding gap?
I guess, simply put, I think it's easy to say you support something, but when you really put your money where your mouth is truly the actions that show, do you really support something? And what I would say is oftentimes, I think, I really put this back to a communication issue, is that I think when you can make the right business cases, executives want to reduce the kind of risk that is out there with security issues. But I think oftentimes people will come in with a PowerPoint deck with a lot of technical slides, and they just bore the group and they don't understand the risk. So I guess the one thing I would want this group to hear is, if you go to present to an executive, you really have 15 minutes total. You will never get their attention for more than 15 minutes. It's like they have ADD. And you have to get your message so someone can understand it in a very clear manner in no more than 15 minutes. And things like this, I use my mother, you know, who knows how to turn on her computer and the internet, but really knows nothing more. I feel like I have to be able to sell this idea to her to be able, and if I can do that, I can then usually get an executive team to buy into what we want to do. But I think oftentimes it's easy to get a slide deck from your staff with lots of technical pictures, a lot of, I see some smiles, so, but, you know, and we need to make it simple so they understand the risks they're taking that you have and what you're doing to reduce that risk. And most executives in this area, we've had many, many examples in the tax arena. The state of South Carolina had a major breach, and we can bring that up over and over, and if it's something that could have helped reduce the risk in that situation, I could get money for almost anything. And not to overuse it, but when they can understand the risks they're taking on, they will pay. And I think, to me, oftentimes we haven't done a good enough job communicating it, or we've communicated it in a way that's not clear. So, and I think money is what really tells you if people support it or not. Not, yes, I support it.
Right. I completely agree with that. It's how you communicate and what you deliver. For us, it's that and the competing priorities that we have versus, do we want to spend money on a data loss prevention system or an electronic health record system? The choice is a lot simpler. But yeah, it really comes down to when you're working with senior leadership is defining risk, identifying it, communicating it in a manner that's understandable, that's tangible. We communicate the probability of that risk, and we communicate the financial impact of that risk. And that has been a very successful approach for our program with our executives, that they fully understand what the risk is and are able to really support what we're looking for.
I want to add one thing. If you ever have something that you haven't been able to get funding for that you think is really, really important, I think you really need to stop and look at timing. And I always think of, we have these major earthquakes or floods or, something, and you need money for your disaster recovery, something. Well, if you can have your slide deck all really ready, your very clear message, I'm going to use disaster recovery, but it could be a security event as well. And you present, we need this to improve our disaster recovery a week after there's been a major incident, it will be a much easier sell. And so, sometimes if you aren't able to get the message and people don't have the money, if there's been a recent breach of whatever type or something in the news that your solution would really be right on, give it time and give it about 2 weeks after a big disaster, get on the calendar, and I think you'll be much more effective. And so I think that's a tip of, if you get stuck, look for the right timing, because that can make all the difference in the world.
Very good. Okay, so George, my experience, I've been doing this for about 22 years, IT, risk management, security, and privacy. And my experience, when you even say the word security, and you want to meet with an executive, it almost flips a switch in their mind. Cybersecurity, security, it kind of flips a switch, almost puts them in a mode where, okay, they already have a predisposed notion about what I'm coming to talk about. So, question for you is, when you have to communicate things like APTs, advanced persistent threats, denial of service attacks, cyber threats, to board of directors, to senior management, what is your approach to how you communicate those topics, but in a way that makes sense to a board or to a business leader?
That has evolved significantly for me in the past 5-6 years. Initially, when I would report to our executive committees and boards, I had a lot of nice statistics, and I showed, hey, this is what's going on, this is how much data we have, and these are the types of incidents that we've experienced for the last few months, last quarter. Didn't make any sense to them. Didn't really drive any kind of decisions from them at that point. What I learned was that that level of individual, and of course, yeah, the 10 or 15 minutes that they give you, you really need to drive in terms that they fully understand. So when we're talking about advanced persistent threats or things of that nature, it comes down to a risk question, and what does that risk really mean to our organization? We know we have value in our data, and we know that there are people out there that want to get to it. So what's the risk? What's that tangible risk, and what's that real loss to our organization? It could be financial, it could be reputational, it could be a combination of all of that. So that's when I communicate to our senior leadership and to our board of directors, it's really that level of information. It's looking at the risk, looking at the probability, and looking at the impact.
I think the reputation is becoming more and more important. Your brand or your reputation. If you're in the healthcare, I mean, if you had a major breach, it could really impact the bottom line. Just like in the tax world, with everyone's financial data, we feel very strongly that if we had a breach, people would feel far less comfortable sending us any kind of electronic data. We'd be flooded with paper, and our costs would go up substantially.
So related question for you, Cathy. What does in your experience, what is the perfect executive briefing that you're expecting to see? What does it look like on cybersecurity and privacy risk to the organization? Can you give the audience a little bit of sense of what that kind of a presentation would look like?
Because I told you have 15 minutes, so it needs to be 15 minutes or less. And I will say, I think the people are very visual people, so I think things that are visual are always more impactful to people. And I will say that I think it's really important to talk about, I always like to use red, yellow, green, and if you have red, yellow, green, and you have executives, guess what they want to talk about? What colors?
Red.
Red and yellow. Do you think they want to hear about anything green? No. And I think, when you only have 15 minutes, I think that's a good thing, because then everything that's green and within the ranges that you hope, I think you don't have to talk about it. And, when I have the perfect briefing, I think I get to hear about education, what we're doing in that arena, what's happening with the data, what kind of issues are we seeing, and then a little bit about the technology. How patched are we? What kind of things on the antivirus, what kind of things we're doing there. And maybe a little bit lower is some of the variances we have and what kind of risks those are we're taking on with those variances. So at a very high level, that's the kind of things. But the more visual you can make it, the better.
That was great. So, George, you had a pretty interesting background. Would you share with the audience your journey that's taken you from when you started to where you are now in terms of owning security and privacy? You talk a little bit about your educational background, training you've gotten over the years, so on and so forth.
Sure. I started my career in IT, and I was part of I was a regional information officer for what used to be a smaller version of Catholic Healthcare West, now Dignity Health. And in that role, in 2000, I remember sitting with, actually there's a gentleman in the room too that sat in the room with me, and we defined the original policies for privacy and security. So that was kind of my first exposure to privacy and security. It was shortly after the HIPAA rules became published and shortly before they became effective. From there, I've moved into different areas. I've been in hospital operations. I've been in legal. I have a Juris Doctor degree and a master's degree in business. And so I have an understanding of not just the IT piece, but other areas as well. I've sort of evolved from different phases in healthcare, and I've been with the same company now for about 20 years. And seen it grow and change, and with that I was actually given the opportunity to grow and change with it as well. So I was able to see all these different facets of healthcare, from being part of a senior leader at a hospital level and dealing directly with patients, to writing contracts and looking at risk from a legal perspective. So it's been an interesting journey for me.
And I guess as a follow-on to that, in your mind, when you think about, and tying back to what you said earlier, Cathy, about the world's only going to get more connected, right? I mean, the perimeter has been gone for a long time, and you could think of it that way. So it's going to be more connectivity, bigger data. So in your mind, George, and then Cathy, maybe you can weigh in, what should ISOs that are now getting into the business or even have been, ISOs for a while, what should they be doing to basically up their game?
Well, for the most part, in this, I'm looking at it from the healthcare perspective. Healthcare is heavily regulated, and the laws change every couple of months. We just had a new rule come out that became effective September 23rd, which caused us to go through a lot of process changes. For a healthcare information security officer, understanding the law and being able to translate that law into business terms is very key to the success of the information security officer. Probably financial services, probably in the government agencies as well. You really have to understand those guidelines that you have to follow, whether they're federal NIST, FIPS rules, things like that. You really have to be able to interpret that information and be able to communicate it and apply it. So the more that we become electronic, the more that we have to share this information. You need to be able to interpret what the legal requirements are, then apply that to how you secure that information and how you enable the business to share that information.
You have any thoughts about that one, Cathy?
Could you ask the question again?
Question is, no worries. The question is, for information security officers, either that are coming into the field or have been in the field, what do you think are the types of, what do you think they should be doing to improve and enhance their capability? Whether it's educational, certification, so on and so forth. What are some of your thoughts about that?
I think it's always good to have a good technical background, but I think I would just say, George, you talked about knowing the law, but I think it's also really important to know the business and to know how people need to use data so that you can protect it in a very smart way. I also would encourage you to, be a forward thinker, and at lunchtime, one of the things, that he talked about is mobile and what's going to happen in that space that is so growing. You need to be thinking ahead. In state government, it takes a while to get money. If you need a BCP and an FSR, you really need 2 years lead time. So be a person that can think forward, help plan, so you can get the money to do things that you need to be doing to continue to secure your environment. And I would always say, constantly work on your communication skills, because the higher up you go, the less you actually do, and you're more communicating with folks, getting others to do work, convincing people you need money, representing your company. So those communication skills, I just think, are so vital.
So kind of a follow-on question, Cathy. So I'm not asking you personally, but what keeps executives up at night as it relates to these cybersecurity and privacy issues? And what should ISOs be doing to help executives sleep better at night in terms of these issues?
I guess the thing that really I always worry about the most is I really worry about internally. I think if something goes wrong and you have staff that haven't changed their password, something that you had complete control over, I think that you're going to be much more scrutinized than having a hacker come in. That's my opinion. I'm not sure that it would be everyone's opinion. But things, if you have your staff and you don't have good policy and they're sending data, an email with millions of records, I think that's going to be far more much more criticized. So the things that your own staff do, that's why I'm such a believer in the education piece, so that they know how to behave and what you expect, and having tools to make sure that your data is staying in your environment, not being shared, I think is really, really important. And those kinds of things, I think we can make really good progress on. Keeping out every hacker is probably impossible. And so I will keep working at that, but I worry more on the internal side of what my own team is doing. As far as disgruntled employees looking at their behavior and watching for changes in behavior, I think things like background checks are really important if that's not something that's on your radar screen. And knowing and watching for behavioral kind of changes in employees that are trusted employees are some of the things that really I worry about, and I think we can do more than we've been doing.
So that's interesting. I want to follow up on your thoughts about the internal threat. So I go back to the Deloitte NASCIO 2012 cybersecurity survey. That was one of the questions we asked. And what was interesting in there was the fact that majority of the state officials, executives that responded were very confident in the state's ability to protect information assets against both internal and external threats. But the state ISOs weren't nearly as confident. Actually, it was 39% to 24%. Why do you think that gap exists? What is the disconnect between the way executives are seeing the world and the way people entrusted to to protect information assets seeing it differently? And George, I'd be curious as to your thoughts as well.
I think that when your job is information security, you are very well read on the topic, you're listening to what's happening, and so you hear a lot of bad things that happen. You come to a conference like this, you hear about did you hear this happened here, did you hear this happen there, and you can go home from events like this and not sleep nearly as well as you did the night before. Where I think executives, they don't have the exposure to the kind of information that we're getting here, and they're not thinking about this risk as deeply as you're thinking about it. So I think they're just not exposed to the issue as well. I will say, so I think that's really the difference. I think if they knew as much as you knew, they would be equally as worried. And I think it's our job to communicate that risk and these concerns to our executive team so that they make smart decisions.
To your earlier point, before George responds, if it's communicated in a way where they understand the same thing that the ISOs understand, but in a business way, funding is probably going to be a little bit easier to obtain.
I truly believe it is when they really understand the risk that's out there. And when they don't, they're like, you need money for what? And if you have the choice of doing something in the customer service arena or doing something in the security arena, you're going to always pick the customer service arena unless you know enough to make the proper decision. And because, no executive wants to take on inordinate risk. Every firm has insurance. I think they think of the security arena as some place they need insurance and will spend money there, but they need to understand why they're spending the money. So that's some of my thoughts. George?
Well, I think our greatest threat is our internal threat. It's those people that we have granted privileges to, who have the right to access the information but choose to do something very bad with it. How do you communicate that to your executives? For instance, do you tell them, well, yeah, well, we know we got bad people out there? That doesn't make any sense to them. It really comes down to being able to articulate what the risks are and what the value of those risks are to the business. It's up to the information security officer to really be able to interpret all those various risks and then be able to communicate them in a manner that is understandable, that is business-like, that is, it's not, techie nuts and bolts. And I think the reason that statistic is off between leadership and security officers is that we're paid to lose sleep because of security issues or the probability of security issues. So that's what we worry about. Our executives are worried about running the business and making that successful. So we're a component of it, but that's our bread and butter.
I think, on the internal employees and trust, I think that with our organization, so I'll just say, in San Francisco, when they had the network administrator that shut out the whole entire city and county of San Francisco, that story really resonated with our executive team because the way that newspaper article was written, I think, it talked about what a trusted employee was. And it wasn't like he just messed up a few records. He shut them completely out. And I think that story or that example would be a good one to help convince people that it's something to be concerned about. I know it really helped us when people leave our department. We have a very tight exit checklist, and it has to be done within 2 days. I think so it really helped us tighten up on that because we saw that, with this incident, we saw someone leaving, and sometimes people don't leave voluntarily from our jobs. And we felt at risk for that and really tightened that up. And sometimes I think the newspaper articles, they never want their name on them. And I think you can visually take the article and put it up there and then summarize it for them. And if you're in San Francisco Chronicle, it just helps make it a tangible thing that people can understand and don't want their firm name, their department name, there on that kind of article.
What I will add to that is the question I always get is what's the probability? So if you have an incident that occurred at another organization or it's been publicized in the newspaper, it's very invaluable to bring that into the conversation because that now justifies the probability calculation.
Which is very tricky because no one's sharing the information with everyone else in terms of I got a database now where I can say, well, this particular attack happened, twice every year or once every 5 years. It's hard to get that data to be able to then calculate likelihood of occurrence. But anyway, we digress. Maybe a slightly controversial question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience to ask questions. Security and privacy. So, George, you own security and privacy now for your organization, and Cathy, your information security privacy officer is the same. Should ISOs be, basically as they evolve and kind of grow, should they be learning more about privacy? And similarly, should privacy officers be learning more about security? Where do you think it's all going?
I'll start. There was an interesting session here in this room right before this one, and I sort of quoted it earlier, which is privacy is the what and security is the how. And really, I think for a security official to understand what they need to do and what they need to secure, they need to have a good grasp of the privacy concept of what you're trying to get at. Because with not understanding that, not understanding the business objectives, it's hard to come up with good, viable solutions that meet that business direction. You can always talk controls. We all know the basic security controls, but how would you apply them in order to create that privacy requirement that the business is driving for?
I just say our world continues to get more and more complex. So I think no matter what role you're in, the more broadly you understand the business you're in. So if you're in technology and the more you understand the business, the more you understand the privacy rules, the more you understand the legal rules that you're dealing with, I think it makes you a much more well-rounded person and a much more effective in your role. So I see this blending of the two, and they're very closely related, and I think it's a good mix when you have our security folks thinking about the privacy piece and what kind of data retention policies you should have, and not just securing it, but what should we really have. And I think those have been some of the more interesting discussions we've had lately about, should we really, how long should we keep this data? And what should, this person needs to share data, we need to share data with them. How to share it? Do we share everything, or can we be more restrictive? And I think they need to go hand in glove.
All right, fantastic. At this point, I'm going to open up to the audience questions you might have directly to the panelists. I see a lot of hands. Okay. Yes.
Good afternoon, Cathy. I've been taking in a couple of notes in regards to the various questions part of the executive team. Okay, so when it came to communication about specific related, that particular risk and things like that, the information security officers had direct accessibility to the executive team because they were part of it. That no longer exists today. So the question I have is how do ISOs address that challenge of not being a part of the executive team? Okay, one. And then two, in regards to understanding the risk and communicating the risk to the executive management. Okay, the directors, the chief executive officers are the ones who are ultimately responsible for whatever risk that particular organization, okay, faces and experiences. So again, how do ISOs communicate that message to the chief executive officers? Because again, in dealing at the state level, okay, the ISOs are not part of the executive team. They fall under the IT shop, so it's a challenge for ISOs.
Yeah, interesting. You know, in my role, I don't report to IT. I'm not part of IT. I'm part of the compliance group. And so my role, you know, which gives me visibility to our C-suite and to the board of directors. So I don't have that challenge. You know, not being able to communicate to that level is definitely something that, you know, I don't know if I'd be able to be successful in not being able to have that audience with that level of individual within my organization. You know, in the past, now it wasn't always the case. You know, we did not have the visibility at the board level, and we did not have visibility at the C-suite. And we relied upon, you know, our vice presidents or the folks that we reported to be able to communicate on our behalf. What was effective for us was really the written communication piece and not so much the verbal communication piece. In being able to document certain risks, being able to analyze them, and in fact, part of what helped me out was being able to articulate in writing to senior leadership that, you know, here's the risk that we have today, and this is why we have this risk, and then here's what we need to do about it. And that while I wasn't the person delivering that message, my boss was the person delivering that message on my behalf, but it was a consistent message. It wasn't something that, you know, it's kind of that game that you play where I can go up to this lady in the first seat and tell her, you know, tell her a story. By the time it comes back around, what happens? The story's completely changed. So I found that having that ability to have written reports will help me out quite a bit in being successful.
Well, you know, if you're not at the table, I would start out with, you know, good reports I think would be awesome, but try and get at least invited to present maybe twice a year to say, here's the risk we have, here's what we're doing about it. And I think as they get to know more about the risk and understand the kind of consequences that they are taking on, sometimes not knowingly, I think that you can be more effective, and I think that they'll ask you back, you know, if you can have effective presentations, and then I think you could be more influential through, you know, we're going to do annual or quarterly or whatever reports and make them so that they can read them and understand them, and then try to do some verbal presentations. You know, a success story or two of we bought a tool, we were able to save this many interactions, or we got this many kind of things we were able to stop. Something that they can understand. It can make a huge difference. And I know you've heard me talk about communication. I'm going to do one advertisement. There's this book called Made to Stick, and I think it is an excellent book. It really it's about success. It says simplify, use unexpected things to help make your message memorable to people. It's the word success. Be concrete. Oftentimes in IT, we want to talk about something, a database schema, they just tune out. Make it something concrete that they can relate to, even if it's less accurate. Sometimes we get so into accuracy, they lose everything. My favorite example is they came in once to talk about, let's decouple a system. No one understood one word of what they said. Finally, at the end of the presentation, one of the executives raised her hand and said, I really have no idea what you just told me. And she said, well, I think she was desperate because she said, well, I want you to imagine a plate of spaghetti in front of you, and we want to just take out a few of the noodles and leave the rest there. And the whole team said, oh, I get that. And then they could understand the concept. Well, as far as being very accurate, it was not, but it really helped the understanding. I think, you know, having credibility is the next C, as far as really having someone who knows something. Emotion, if you could somehow get an emotion involved, and S, stories are really much more memorable. So I think it's that was the 2-minute version of it, and it's really a quick read. And if you have to communicate stuff and make it so people can understand, it is a great read.
Yes, you, sir.
This is kind of a follow-on almost to the privacy security question, but HIPAA is the example. You have a set of privacy rules and a set of security rules. The implication, perhaps the direction in the industry, is to have those functions converge a little more. And I guess the specific question is do you see those converging into one person or group's responsibility, or do you think they'll be separate?
And I'll have to say, probably there's a recent trend that I've been noticing, and my role of taking on both responsibilities is relatively new. I was a security officer for many years, and now they've given me the privacy challenge. I've seen it happen in other industries. I think the most recent one that I was reading about was Intel. Their chief information security officer is now responsible for privacy. Not regulated like HIPAA, but their software, they have lots of entrusted information. I see in healthcare, if you do not have leadership that works well together in privacy and security, that could be a detriment to the healthcare organization. They need to work very closely in order to one, determine the privacy needs, and then get the effective security controls to support those privacy needs. I don't know about other industries, but I have seen a trend in several others as well where those two roles are being combined under one executive.
I want to piggyback just off the question. So in the healthcare, it makes sense that privacy and security go together because that's what you're protecting. But so I work in the education institution, and privacy and security are actually somewhat at odds. The professors want their privacy. The security folks want to be able to look at all email and everything that gets transferred. And so they're actually fighting. So how do you see in the future, in those industries, the privacy and security are at odds, how they can kind of gap that?
And I think that's probably the main thing is that you're at odds. In healthcare in particular, having to be able to work cohesively is important. In educational, I've known a few of the privacy officers for the UC system, and they express similar challenges in that where they had certain privacy, and some of them had medical centers in their UCs, but not just that, but on the educational side, they expressed similar things. They were challenged by security to have certain controls in place. But the privacy aspect was, here's what we really needed to have. I don't know what the trend is going to be there as whether combining the two roles would make sense. It all depends on what the driving forces are for it. If it means that if you can accomplish it with somebody, an individual that understands both perspectives, that may make sense. But that's up to having that right type of individual. If it's if you're trying to combine it and put you put your security person in charge of privacy, it's hard to fathom because you don't know what that person's the background, their experience, what they're going to drive for is. So I'm not giving you a straight answer on this because I don't know how it's going to be. And it all depends on what the challenges are, and if it's something that you want to have more cohesive interaction, then probably.
I think your leadership is really going to probably drive whether they stay apart or separate by the kind of direction they want to go. If they want those two organizations to be closer together and work together, or if they want both to have their own independent. I think it's, in your example, I think whoever's at the top is going to be the driver of whether it's they stay together or be apart.
Yeah, and I can add in too, I think you see the same issues in other industries like the tech industry or biotech and pharma, where where you're butting heads is we want the people that come up with the great drugs or the great next technology to innovate, and we don't want them burdened with all of these security controls, but at the same time that innovation, that intellectual property is worth money, right? And so the trend I've seen is that there are more steering committees and working groups coming together with privacy and security and risk management folks, forming these kind of steering committees or working groups to be able to really address the problem.
I think it's interesting. Basically what you were saying earlier, that you got a JD. And using the legal system to address that issue is going to keep for us to be successful. That, once you deal with it from a legal perspective, it really separates. It's clear, it's black and white. That's the direction you have to head, because it's basically set by council. So that's one of the interesting things I see from your perspective is you got that legal background to drive that conversation.
Any other questions? Yes, Justin.
A few years ago, I read that there was this effort to kind of consolidate, infuse, I guess, information security elements with a technology background. And I think in the C-level suite, people were just trying to get rid of one head and give one guy a few more hats to wear and call it good. Do you see that? I haven't heard anything about that in the last year or two. Has security and privacy suddenly pulled out and become so important that one person can't wear the technological hat, the information technology officer and the security officer being the same person anymore? Are they separate, or is there still an effort at the executive level to try and merge those people into one?
Well, I can tell you at Franchise Tax Board, what we've tried to do is reach a balance of our ISO reports to our admin chief and has a dotted line into me, the technology organization, to try and keep the separation of duties as far as, which we think has been good to have someone focused on the technology and delivery, but someone else there saying, make sure it's secure, and having she really could go two routes as far as getting to our executive officer, because she has sometimes I'm sure she feels like she has two bosses she reports to. I mean, she meets with me as I think about as often as her own boss. And I think it's been a good balance so that we can focus on delivery, but we also focus on the security and privacy. But I think the state trend is for them to all be in the same organization. We're a little bit on the outlier side. But sometimes we like healthy tension. We think that causes some better decisions. So.
I think it's important to know what your organization is and what data you have and what your risk tolerance is. Because maybe if your risk tolerance is very high, you have very little confidential data or proprietary information or whatever, you can maybe afford to have a combined role a little bit more. You're willing to accept a lot of risk. Maybe you're in the
I'll add a couple of comments to that. And that on the risk tolerance side, I've been with the same company for about 20 years, and I've seen that risk tolerance level fluctuate every few years. It's all based on where we're at, what kind of decisions we're making, whether we're being financially successful or we're not. So that you need to really be engaged in where the organization is, where the department is, to make sure that you understand the risk tolerances. For us, we moved the information security officer outside of IT and made it someone who reports into the compliance department through the CFO. We don't foresee ever combining the two roles because our CFO put it as, we don't want the fox watching the hen house, is what he said. So that was how he was able to get our board of directors to then agree to having the separate positions. So that's what I've seen in the healthcare arena. I've seen a lot of the larger healthcare organizations doing the very same thing, moving the information security officer role outside of IT.
As a corollary, do you see a trend towards the information security officers having more, I mean, is there a requirement for more technical knowledge of what goes on in the trenches, or, I mean, that's a hard balance between, if you're going to have people who are taking care of things on a technical level, and yet still trying to talk at a story level to the executives with three primary colors. Are you saying that information security officers need to be more technically savvy?
I would opt to more business savvy than, if you told me I could have more business or more technical, I'd take more business for the leader of the organization. You'll have a team that's very technical. That would be that's my preference.
And likewise, I rely on my staff and the technical folks to be able to deliver the technology piece. And my job is to be able to articulate what they're doing in a business manner and articulate the risks involved. That's really it.
All right, so to wrap this up, if you could just, Cathy and George, just leave the audience with just what is the most important thing you should take away from today? If you just had to give them one thing, say this is the most important thing to take away from today's discussion.
I would say be a great communicator about the risk and how to mitigate that risk for your organization.
That's really it. It's being able to articulate clearly in the terms that are understandable to the business in order to get your initiatives moving forward. And it's really, having the ability to communicate at various levels. Talking about your technical folks, you need to be able to talk to them. You need to be able to understand what they're telling you, but you also need to be able to speak in different terms.
All right, I'd like to thank both of our panelists, Cathy, Cleek, DeCesare.